is where I can see it, so I'll put it on top of your pad. Is that all right?
Sure. Oh, sure. Wow, empty audience here. That's all right.
Welcome to the presentation of the CHI Lifetime Achievement Award in Practice. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce the awardee. Jeff Johnson is somebody who I've had the privilege of knowing for many years, and in many of his different areas of interest and expertise that sort of come together in his achievements. So I'll start off by saying that every day when I go to my office, I see Jeff's face. And that's because right as you get off the elevator, there's a display case of historical computers, and one of them is the Chromemco computer. I don't know how many of you remember Chromemco. It's credited along with Apple as being one of the first really practical personal computers. Started at Stanford, and Jeff was one of the early employees, and his employee badge is there in the case along with the ancient computer. So he was a student at Stanford. He did his PhD in cognitive psychology, and I think I'm going to describe three different strands that sort of weave together in his career, and one of them comes from the fact that he really did start off with an academic research component in cognitive psychology, and although he chose not to go into an academic track, I think that has always been a big part of why he does so well in the practice, because it's grounded in understanding of the basic fundamental science, the basic issues of psychology. He has been involved in CHI. He said, I found out that he attended his first CHI conference in 1983. So he's been really one of the founders of the field. And the second place where I sort of intersected with him, although I didn't get to know him until later, was Xerox. He was not at PARC, as Alan was talking about earlier, but was in the development group for the STAR. And again, I look out at older faces. Alan would complain the younger people don't even know what the STAR was. But STAR, for many, many years in my course on Introduction to HCI, one of the papers I had the students read right at the beginning was the paper about the Xerox STAR, which was written by Jeff and his colleagues. He was the lead author. And they're always amazed to say, oh, that was all there already back in those days? I mean, they thought it all started with a Macintosh, right? So he was on the development team. He was working on the interface and doing what we would now consider core HCI back before there were many people even realizing that it was something that needed to be done. I encountered him actually at first. I was one of a group who was at PARC, and Stanford who created an organization called Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility back in the early 80s, looking at ways in which we as computer scientists could help prevent nuclear war was the fundamental issue at that time. And Jeff at that time had gone from Xerox to US West, and were you the founder, I think, of the chapter in Colorado? Yeah, he was the founder of the CPSR chapter in Colorado, and I got to know him through that, and that's the third strand, okay? The first is psychology, second is development and HCI, and the third is his social conscience and his willingness to put a lot of his effort and his time into thinking about not just what you can build, but what effect that will have on the world and on the people. So he later became national chair of CPSR, and we worked together for many years on issues relating to how computers were going to lead to either benefits or problems, but what the consequences were in society. He came back to this area, worked for HP and for Sun, but he soon decided he could excuse me, offer a lot by doing consulting and practice in HCI design, and back to his academic roots, he wrote books that help people understand. And his books on bloopers, he's got some of the books up here on the podium, you can take a look. He had this fundamental recognition that we learned from psychology, that you learn more from things that don't work than from things that do work. Because when they do work, you say, that's great. When they don't work, you say, why? And so his books on bloopers were really great for teaching people about what works in interface by seeing what doesn't work and why it doesn't work. And he did two editions of GUI bloopers, and then he did another one on web bloopers, and those are sort of core reading and getting people to understand the practice of HCI, not just the theory. And then, returning to his cognitive psychology roots, his latest book is called Designing with the Mind in Mind. So his influence academically and in practice has been very large, both through his own work and through the things he's written. In the social domain, he's done a tremendous amount in building organizations, building things within CHI. He's been very, very active in CHI for many years, doing courses and panels and all sorts of running conferences, all sorts of things which bring the community together. He created the Social Impact Poster Track, along with Ben Schneiderman, who's here, back many years ago, CHI 92. He served on the SIGCHI Public Policy Committee since 2004, and he's organized many projects dealing with the social responsibility of computer scientists, in particular in HCI. So all of these together really have led to the achievements that we're celebrating in giving him the Lifetime Achievement Award. It's a great pleasure for me to be able to introduce him and to hear what you have to say.
Thank you. Don't go away yet. I'm particularly pleased to have Terry be introducing me because Terry has always been one of my heroes. Back when I was a student intern in the summer of 1970 at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, I got interested in artificial intelligence, and so I had the JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, order me a book that Terry had written, and they said, "Do you really want to order this? Because it costs like over $100. And I said, "Yes, I do want to order it." So they ordered it for me, and here it is. It's a little worn at this point, but it's called Procedures as a Representation for Data in a Computer Program for Understanding Natural Language by Terry Winograd at Massachusetts Institute of Technology.
Great.
I'm giving it to you.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Just to be clear, I never sold books for that price. This is university microfilms, charging an outrageous amount to give you a dissertation in those days.
Right. So thank you very much, Terry.
Okay, thank you.
And also, I'd like to thank SIGCHI for this great honor. It's a little bit overwhelming, I have to say. When SIGCHI notified me of the award, they said that they'd cover my flights to and from the conference. I live in San Francisco, 45 miles or 60 kilometers away. So it turns out that Travelocity, strangely enough, could not find any flights from San Francisco to San Jose. And of course, what they tell me is that try arriving or departing one day earlier, or search again without advanced options. You know, when you try that, it doesn't get you anywhere. SIGCHI also said I had to give a 1-hour talk. Now, I will say that it would be natural for me to talk about what I've been working on for the last 2 years. But one problem about being a practitioner, and you should all know this if you're in research and you want to become a practitioner, is that there is one drawback, and that is at any point in time, a practitioner's recent work is usually proprietary and cannot be discussed in public in detail. So I've been working for the last 2 years mostly for the Federal Trade Commission, and all I'm permitted to say is that I've been advising them on consumers' ability to distinguish ads from non-ads online, and that the FTC issued guidance about that in December. I checked with them, and that's all I can say. So that would be a short talk. I decided to say a little more than that, so I'm going to talk about something else, which is I'm going to talk about the gap between research and practice and offer my thoughts on how to close that gap. But even with that, I was worried about how it would fill an hour. So I padded my talk with photos from my latest trip to South Africa and Namibia, like these. So, in the abstract for this talk, I said that I oscillated between research and practice and seemed to have settled into the role of educator of practitioners. That's the role I seem to have found for myself as a consultant. But let me explain how the oscillations got started and what I've learned about the relationship between research and practice. Now, by research versus practice, I want to make clear that I don't mean academia versus industry, because I include industry research labs under research. Now, I'm going to be talking about how to and how not to make research useful to practitioners, learned from my years of experience on this. I'm going to explain why usability worldwide will get worse before it gets better. And I'm going to talk about I'm going to give you a little example of a case study that I'm working on now of how to show practitioners how to design for an aging population. It's basically a pending book that I'm writing with a colleague. Okay, so the oscillation started in high school. You know, today's Thursday, right? So that makes it Throwback Thursday, right? So here's a throwback. Here I am as managing editor of my high school newspaper. I had a column called Jeff's Jargon. Back in those days, I wasn't sure if I wanted to be a writer, a journalist, or a scientist, specifically a physicist. And so on the high school newspaper, I wrote this column called Jeff's Jargon. And then I also built a cloud chamber. So I actually was working part-time in addition to going to high school, I was working at UCLA in the physics department, and they taught me how to build a cloud chamber. And so I built this cloud chamber. And so what you're looking at there are, those tracks are subatomic particles, or are alpha particles coming from the alpha emitter on the pinhead. Now those, I have to say, were the good old days when students in high school could mail order radioactive material. So I managed to get those photographs. Now the oscillation continued in college and graduate school. I bounced from physics to computer science and then to cognitive psychology. And even after I'd settled into a psychology major, I kept one foot in computer science by working part-time and doing summer programming jobs and working, as I said, at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. What I want to say about that is that I'm a flip-flopper. Basically, I've been flip-flopping most of my life between writing and I like doing research, and I like learning new stuff, but I also like making stuff and explaining stuff to others. And I never managed to choose between science, engineering, and writing as a career. So that's why I kind of ended up as a consultant that does a lot of writing and training. The flip-flopping continued into my professional career. So if we look at the jobs that I've had since finishing graduate school, so there's Crememco, which Terry mentioned, and which was practice only. I was not doing any research at Crememco, just writing word processing software and statistical processing software. And then I went to Xerox Information Systems, which is not Xerox PARC. I want to make that clear. I did not work at Xerox PARC, but I worked at Information Systems, and I did mostly design and implementation of word processing and document editing systems, but there were thorny problems that we couldn't solve, and so we had to actually go to PARC and pull research from them. And so it turns out that it's hard to get researchers to work on problems that you as a practitioner need solved because they have their own problems that they're interested in working on. So I ended up having to start the research and then go to them and say, I have this research question, and the people in PARC would eventually collaborate with me. And a number of papers came out of that. One of them was a STAR retrospective paper. which was written between me and some people at Park, but it also there was a paper on document editing systems that came out of that. Then I went to US West Advanced Technology, the phone company, and I was a researcher, and I worked on the issue of modes and the issue of responsiveness in user interfaces. HP Labs, again, I was a researcher, and continued to work on responsiveness and task-specific versus generic applications. And actually, I got a number of papers out of that, which I published here at CHI. So that was, I'm proud of the fact that I'm a practitioner who actually has some CHI papers in my resume. Then I went to work for Sun, and Sun spun out a little secret lab called First Person, where they were developing touchscreen systems, and so I did a bunch of research for them on how touchscreens work and how big touchscreens need to be and how accurate they can be and which way you slide when you want to pan and that sort of thing, and some of those, that resulted in CHI papers as well. Then I went to Sun Developer Products, and there I was only a practitioner, and since I've been a consultant, I've done a combination of both practicing, I guess you would say, and that's the trouble with practitioners. We only practice, we don't ever get good at it. Well, maybe actually because we practice, we get good at it. And so as a consultant, I've actually been lucky enough to be hired onto some projects by actual industry research labs and have worked on things like social networks, consumers and advertising, as I said, for the FTC, and older adults on the web. Okay, so that sort of gives you this idea, shows you how the flip-flopping has occurred over my career. And now with all this flip-flopping, I've learned some things, some lessons about tensions between research and practice, that is development. And again, I don't mean academia versus industry, I'm including industry research on the research side. And I've learned about what works and doesn't work to make research palatable and useful to practitioners. But before I show you that, let's look at some more pictures from Africa. Now, I have to say here that I'm treading on sort of well-trodden ground because many others have addressed this topic before me. So last year, for example, Susan Dre in Seoul won the Lifetime Practice Award, and her talk was it was called Bridges, Not Walls, and it described how academics and practitioners can better work together. If you missed that talk, by the way, it's available on the CHI 2015 website, and I urge you to go look at it. Susan also tells me that there was a symposium of practitioners and academics at the University of Nottingham this last year, and there's been a series of workshops at CHI, UXPA, and other conferences on the relationship between research and development. And then, of course, we have Ben Schneiderman's new book, The New ABCs of Research, which talks about this topic. So I feel a little bit like, wow, you know, there's all this other stuff going on, but that's not gonna stop me. As you know, I'm opinionated, and so that's not gonna stop me from giving you my thoughts on this topic. I can fairly say that within the CHI community, I was among the early ones to be worried and concerned about this topic. There was a panel at CHI 96 called Technology Transfer, So Much Research, So Few Products, and it was chaired by Ellen Isaacs and John Tang, and the panelists were, including me, were Jim Foley, Alan Kaczynski, Gene Schultz, and John Bennett. Now, one of the things that's hard for me to realize is that was 20 years ago. That was 20 years ago. And some of the people on that panel are no longer with us. John Bennett and Alan Kaczynski. So that panel resulted in a bunch of position papers which were published in a section of CACM called So Much Research, So Few Good Products. And my article, my position paper in the CACM issue in 1996 was called R bidirectional arrow D, not R&D. And the point of that article let's see, really the gist of that paper, and I actually have a copy of the paper here. This is that issue of CACM, so you can take a look at it. But the gist of the paper is that R&D, which many people consider to be one term, one word, is not one term. It's two, science versus engineering. And the product of research is information, that is to say knowledge, and the product of development is artifacts, that is prototypes. And researchers and developers need different skills. That is to say, researchers, they know the literature really well, they're analytical, they don't jump to conclusions, they doggedly pursue the truth over many years, whereas developers, they work within constraints, they synthesize quickly, they juggle projects, and they make decisions based on incomplete information. Researchers also read a lot, and I found that developers, unfortunately, in some cases, don't necessarily read a lot, which is why my books over the years have been getting thinner and thinner and thinner. Now, unfortunately, in our industry, R&D are often treated as one thing, as I said, R&D. Or they're treated as having the same goal with time to product as the criterion for categorizing whether the work is research or development. And so this model, which I'll expand here on the slide, came out has been used for a long time, and it was used actually in most of the research labs where I worked as a researcher. The management followed this model, and I found it to be quite constraining and not satisfactory. And but Ben's book, by the way, which I've seen parts of, Ben's book points out that the Hills and Valleys model came from Vannevar Bush in the 1940s. I didn't know that back when I was fighting against this model at HP Labs and other places. So thank you, Ben. But Bush was Bush was head of the U.S. Office of Scientific Research and Development. And he had many brilliant insights, but with all due respect, as I said in 1996, and Ben says in greater detail in his book, the Hills and Valleys model is wrong and leads to misguided business decisions. A better model is to distinguish R&D based not on time ranges, not on time to product, but rather on whether the goal is to develop knowledge or a product. Basically, what researchers should not do is they should not do research and then push it over a wall to developers and say, make this into a product. That's not going to succeed very well. Or if it succeeds, it's because of chance. It's better to connect research with development in advance. That is to go, as Ben and others have said, is to go and find some issues that need to be resolved in the world and then conduct research. There will be plenty of research that you can do and you can publish it as well, as I have. So, back to Africa. This is Namibia, the famous sand dunes of Namibia. So, well, actually what I'll say is I'll refer you to this article on the details of this, of how to better connect research with development, because I don't have a lot of time here. If you've never been to Namibia, you should go. Now, 16 years later, after this CACM article was published, Austin Henderson and I, in 2012, wrote an article for UXPA's Journal of Usability Studies called Usability of Interactive Systems. It will get worse before it gets better. And basically what that article says is that it says that the HCI field and CHI conferences have been around for about 35 years. Why are there still so many bad products and online services? And the problem is that you hear people at CHI saying things like, they'll look at something that's being presented at CHI this year and they'll say, well, that's nothing new. We did that back 15 years ago in the XYZ project. Well, the problem is innovation is great, but it ain't out there until you disseminate it. It needs to be disseminated before it's out there, okay? And if you don't disseminate it, it's just a research paper. Stuart Card, who's another one of my mentors, makes the distinction between pioneers and settlers. We need pioneers and we need settlers. Dissemination of HCI knowledge often lags decades behind research because basically researchers and developers and managers are not following Ben's and my recommendations on how to better integrate research with development. What I found and what's talked about in that Journal of Usability Studies paper is that the most big makers of digital products and services that have been around for a long time get it. I find that many big companies that have software development, they get it. They have UX people, and those people are hooked up with the HCI world. They send people to CHI. But here's the problem. The universe is expanding. The universe is expanding quickly. The universe of digital developers and products is expanding faster than the light from our HCI field can reach all parts of it. And here's why it's expanding. Oops, let's back up. It's expanding because former makers of non-digital products are now making digital products. So for example, many of my client companies, as a consultant, many of my client companies, 20 years ago, they were building test tubes and Bunsen burners, and now they make genetic analysis software. They know nothing about software, about user interface development, okay? And there are many small startups in the developed world are started by people with no experience in our field. And tech development is spreading worldwide, and there are developers all over the world who have learned how to program in whatever the current latest language is, but they don't know HCI. Okay, so the universe is expanding, and the light from our field has yet to reach many of those parts of the universe. And so we have a lot of work to do, basically. That's why I say it will get worse before it gets better. Now, previous people in our field have warned about this problem. It's been warned about in Tom Landauer's book, The Trouble with Computers, way back in the 80s. Okay? And Don Norman worried about it in his book, The Invisible Computer. These are all books I recommend highly. And Alan Cooper worried about it in his book, The Inmates Are Running the Asylum. The common message of these books is that HCI field needs to do better at disseminating our knowledge. We have a lot of knowledge. It just needs to be disseminated to all parts of this expanding universe. Now, here's an example of some things that don't work to transfer knowledge from researchers to practitioners. Okay? The Handbook of Human-Computer Interaction Handbook. Look how thick it is. I don't know any developers who've read this book. Okay, and that's an example of a paper that comes out of it. That's not gonna cut the mustard. Now, it's great for researchers to communicate between themselves. It's not great for transmitting knowledge to practitioners. Another example is Chi papers. I'm really sorry to tell you this, but most of the web designers out there have never read a Chi paper and never will. Journal articles, similarly. To make research palatable and useful to practitioners, that is to say, web designers, user interface designers, UX designers, software developers, we, the people in this room, and the people out there in the hallway, have to digest the knowledge that we have learned and reproduce it in a form that is more palatable to your average developer, okay? And so the kinds of things that I highly recommend are, for example, the training programs that are put on by many of the companies that are represented here at Chi. So the Nielsen Norman Group, User Interface Engineering and Human Factors International, and my own consulting company have sort of training programs where people can learn about our field and learn about human-computer interaction in a pre-digested way that's more suitable for how they learn. I would have to say the books that I found in the field that are the top books, I'd like to say mine are in that category, but they're not. And so the top books I would say in that are Don Norman's Design of Everyday Things. It's a mega seller after 20 years or so. In fact, I have an original copy when it was still called The Psychology of Everyday Things. I need to get Don to sign it at some point. Jacob Nielsen's book, Designing Web Usability. It's getting a little old at this point, but it's still quite popular among web designers. And Steve Krug, this is the top seller. Steve Krug's Don't Make Me Think is a wonderful, wonderful book for web developers and web designers. In fact, I even recommend it to people who aren't doing web, if they're doing apps, because it has so many good insights. And then we also have textbooks that get to developers and practitioners because they get to them when they're students. So you know, the people who do these textbooks are doing a great service as well for our field. So my own attempts at disseminating practice knowledge via books have been fairly successful, but I have to admit, not as successful as Norman Nielsen and Krug and Ben Schneiderman. But they are these books that Terry mentioned: GUI Bloopers, Web Bloopers, GUI Bloopers 2.0, Designing with the Mind in Mind, Conceptual Models, and Designing with the Mind in Mind 2. And I have, by the way, there are copies of them here. You can look at them. I don't want to take them back to San Francisco, so I've donated them to the conference, and they're going to give them to the students in the student room afterwards. So if you're a student, don't come up here and grab one. There's going to be some process by which they'll be given out. Okay, so back to Africa for a few minutes here. So nowadays, I'm starting yet another attempt to translate our knowledge from our field into a form that will be useful to practitioners, and I'm doing that with my colleague Kate Finn, who's here in the audience somewhere. Raise your hand, Kate. There she is. And it's going to be published by Elsevier, Morgan Kaufman, late 2016 or early 2017. And what it's about is explaining why age-friendly design is needed, age-related declines and differences, problems older adults have with technology. By the way, I include myself in the category of older adults in case any of you wanted to know. I've just lost my notes here. Just a second, let me get back to them. Okay. I don't know why that happened. Technology is wonderful, isn't it? You know, older adults have trouble with technology. Okay. A friend of mine, by the way, just an aside, a friend of mine who's a musician uses her iPad to show her the music while she's playing piano, and she accompanies singers, and she told me that she had an interesting experience where she was in the middle of accompanying a singer during a performance, people were in the audience, and the iPad froze. And so she said, while continuing to play, I had to turn the iPad off, turn it back on, and restart the app while continuing to play. That's an impressive pianist. Okay, so this is what the book covers, and it also has guidelines for designing age universal technology. So I'll give you a little bit of hints of what kind of things are going to be in the book. So it talks about, makes the case for age-friendly design by showing some of the population statistics and basically how the proportion of older adults in the world is increasing and how it's going to continue to increase, especially in the developed world. And also showing that older adults are actually the fastest growing demographic online. That is, other groups at this point, other age groups have already adopted online use in large percentages. Older adults started out slower and now are moving up quickly, so it's going to become more important as time goes on. And the interesting thing is that technology can really help older adults. So older adults are actually among the many populations that could most benefit from being able to use technology. So here's some quotes from actual older adults that were posted online at various comments in the New York Times, I believe this was. So this person said, "A Mac laptop opened the world to me right here from my kitchen table. It's a blessing because my mobility is now extremely limited due to my physical disability." And then we have a person saying, "I can keep in touch with people all over the world." And then we have these other quotes too. So these show that older adults are not, as the stereotype sometimes suggests, adverse to technology. They actually embrace it if they can actually use it, if it actually is designed for them. They would love to be able to use it. The problem is that they often can't use it. There's so much to remember. I wish they would stop changing things for no good reason. What happened to the menus? How can I make the font bigger? I can't see it. Blah, blah, blah. Who thought thin gray letters was a good idea? These are actual quotes. These are actual quotes from online older adults talking about the problems that they have with today's technology. It's embarrassing to have to ask my grandkids for help. And, you know, how many of you heard the term digital natives? So there's this meme going around that, you know, today's older folks are not digital natives, they're digital immigrants, and once they all die, the whole problem is solved. We don't have to design for older adults anymore. The problem is that's wrong for many reasons. It's wrong because, one, first of all, not all young adults today are technical whizzes, right? So basically, the part of those ideas that not only will everything be solved when today's older adults die off, but when today's younger adults grow up and become older adults, we won't need to design especially for them because they know everything about digital technology. But how many of your relatives who are young still don't understand the difference between Wi-Fi and cellular? I mean, so, you know, it's not true that young adults are technical whizzes. Secondly, technology will continue to develop. It's not going to stop. So just because people know digital technology today doesn't mean that they're going to understand quantum technology 20 years from now. Okay? Everyone gets stuck in whatever time period they grew up with. And all of those, many of the age-related changes that occur with vision and hearing and motor control, those are going to happen to everybody and continue to happen to everyone as long as humans are human. Okay, so this digital natives versus digital immigrants thing is just a red herring. So Kate and I did a usability study where we looked at travel websites. Did you know that there's a whole section of the travel industry aimed at people over 50? There is a whole segment of the travel industry aimed at older adults because, at least in the developed world, older adults have money and time, and they do a lot of traveling. So this whole segment of the travel industry is aimed at them, and they have websites. And guess what? Their customers can't use those websites. We did a study that was published in 2013, Usability Study of Websites for Older Travelers. And the results were fail, 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 basically. They don't work for older adults. Older adults can skim through the websites and figure out what trips are out there, but they can't book them. They can't book trips online. And so when we approached those companies and told them what some of the problems were we found, the response we got back from them pretty much uniformly was, we don't put much effort into our website because our customers mostly don't use it, they just call us. Yeah, they call you because your website doesn't work. And that means you have to have a calling center. And by the way, the calling center can't be in Bangalore because of the particular customers you have wouldn't be able to deal with that. So, you know, it's going to cost you a lot of money to have that calling center. So I want to show you some examples here. This is somebody trying to use a menu, pull right, pull down menus in a travel website to choose a trip to Kenya.
So like when I went up here to, to get the country first, I went up here to go to, go up here to, is bouncing around, a Kenya thing here. Okay, so I went in here, down Africa. It's taken me like 5 times to click on the country.
Okay, how many of you have had trouble with that kind of a website? And then here's another one.
At this point, I would call them. This is so overwhelming.
Okay.
I would call them and say, help.
And then here's another example. This is our last example here.
So at this point, if you were, really looking for a trip, what would you do next if we weren't here? What do you think?
I would screw this. I would say, if I can't get to what I want in reasonable tries, that this is not, I don't want to go to this company.
So they lost the customer. Back to Africa briefly. This is an orphanage in Namibia. Now I just want to say something about this picture. I haven't really talked about most of the pictures, and you can ask me questions about them later, but I want to say something about this picture, which was we were visiting what's called in Namibia an informal settlement, which we would call a slum. And that's that girl's house. That's her house. And she's drawing in the sand, in the dirt with her stick. And I've played this game with kids in Africa a lot. And usually it's, this is my house, please draw your house. And I draw my house and they draw their house. Or this is my cow, draw your pet and I'll draw something. But so I went over, I saw her drawing, and I went over and asked her what she was drawing. This is what she drew. And she said, I said, well, what are those things? And she said, that's a smartphone, that's a flip phone, that's a tablet, and that's a laptop computer. As our keynote speaker on Monday said, the changing face of Africa. Okay, so to sum up here, I talked about my oscillation between research and practice. I talked about how to connect research with practice. I talk about why things are going to get worse before they get better because of the expanding universe and the fact that the light from Chi only travels so fast. I talked a little bit about what works for practitioners and what doesn't. And I talked about my next attempt, which is to show practitioners how to design for an aging population. All right, so after a few more pictures from Africa, we will be done. So thank you to SIGCHI for this great honor and for your attention. Thanks. I'll answer any questions if there are any. Sorry? Post it? 3 feet.
Thank you so much. I'm a practitioner and I have published. I love the idea of making our work more available. I love the idea of making it beautiful and accessible to a wider audience. The business model for the publishing world today, how would that need to adjust, refine, to make access more available?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and it's going to be difficult for me to answer because I'm not that, it's very difficult to be able to write a book. I have all these books, but you don't know how many publishers I've approached in order to be able to write those books. So part of the problem is that, publishers are consolidating, the companies are getting bigger and bigger, and they're buying other publishing companies, and then they're cutting costs. And so many companies have adopted essentially a format in which your book must fit. And if it doesn't fit that format, then they're not interested in you. Or the other thing that happens is that authors go to the publisher and the publisher says, before we even read your proposal, you need to tell us how big is your Twitter following? How many friends do you have on Facebook? What is your online web presence? Because if you're not mega popular, see, the problem is they don't want to market the book. They want you to market the book. And so if you're not going to, if the book's not going to market itself or you're not going to market it, they don't want to deal with you. And so that's getting harder and harder and harder. So it is getting harder and harder to write books. But you know what? We as authors can sidestep that process, right? Because there are now all these self-publishing services. And so if my view is if the publishers are actually giving less and less and less to the author, then what use are they at all, right? And so we can start publishing ourselves. Now, what that will mean, however, is that there will be more and more crap out there, right? And so we will have to, some mechanism will have to come into being that allows people to sift through the crap and get to the good stuff. I don't know what that will be yet. I'm open to good ideas about that. Bonnie.
Yeah, hi. Now a practitioner, I'd like to know, you didn't mention patterns and patterns libraries and patterns languages, and I'd like to know your views on that, and in particular also, what's the role of rationale when you disseminate a pattern? Because in my experience, software engineers say, why? Why should I do that? And so many of them don't have that rationale.
Okay. I'll say it by saying that these books were intended to be anti-patterns, right? Don't do this instead, right? So, and in fact, some people criticize these books by saying, I don't want to learn by what's wrong, show me what's right. And one of the things that I hasten to point out is that in these books, it does say what's right, it just leads with what's wrong, right? And so I started out in this field sort of writing these anti-patterns books, but I acknowledge that there are many good patterns books out there. The Landay's book, right, is one of them. And so that's part of your question. I do recommend patterns to my clients. The other thing is that the other part of your question had to do with rationale. And I decided when I was writing these books, the bloopers books, that I needed to show lots of examples, visual examples, that would sort of drive points home. Well, it turned out from, after having done that for a number of years, it turned out that developers actually wanted to know why. Why is that a blooper? Why is this right? Why is that wrong? And so that's when I decided to sort of go back to my roots as a cognitive psychologist and try to write something about where do these guidelines come from so that people would have some basis for. Basically, I wanted to stop the religious wars that were occurring in companies. I'm right, you're wrong, I think it should be this way, I think it should be that way. And so I wanted to say, look, there is such a thing as human short-term memory. It has these characteristics, There is such a thing as peripheral vision, which has these characteristics. And so that's where this book came from. And by the way, when I sat down to write it, I realized that my understanding of human cognitive psychology was 20 years old. It had to be updated. So I had to spend a year reading before I could write Designing with the Mind in Mind. I don't know, maybe that answers your question. Next question?
But did you stop the religious wars?
Well, many people come up to me and say, I use your book, I carry it to meetings so that I can stop the religious wars that are going on. I had
SIGCHI from Google and formerly from Xerox PARC. First of all, I wanted to say that thank you very much for sharing your lifelong journey with us. Not just your trip to Africa, but also the years that you spent at Xerox and other places. I thought that was a very inspiring story that you told today. And also, of course, for being such a wonderful human being and being so humble about it. I've certainly very much enjoyed the interaction we've had over the years, both back at Xerox as well as every chance I've had to talk with you. I wanted to mention to you that now that I've been at Google for about 5 years, when product designers and UX researchers sometimes come to me and ask, I want to learn more about HCI and what books should I read, I actually point them to your books. And for precisely the reasons that you pointed, which is that, pointed out, which is that they're much more digestible and they're much more transferable. And learning from negative examples, as I now know from machine learning, being a machine learning researcher.
Okay, I'll give you your $20 after the session.
It's actually better than learning from positive examples. I want to touch on one particular point I think that you made during your talk, which I thought was very interesting, having to do with the relationship between research and development. I think the model that you pointed out actually is the model that increasingly more and more companies are taking. And I think to some extent Google did.
You mean Hills and Valleys or the new model?
The new model, the
Okay,
one where
right.
research and development are not divided by time horizon, but rather by artifact versus knowledge output. I thought that was a very good insight. I would like you to comment on the fact that one thing that I've been very worried about in this community has actually been what I perceive to be a decline in industry involvement, if you will, at least in the sense of proportion. It seems like there's just less and less industrial research labs that are around, first of all, and secondly, I personally feel like there's less and less dialogue between the industry and the research community. Do you perceive the same threat, or am I just crazy?
No.
And what, because you have multi-decade of view on this, and so I just would be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, like I was saying, it's hard for many practitioners to come to CHI and to get much out of it unless they go to the courses, right? The courses, that's what the courses are for them, right? But the research talks, unless they're really curious about a particular topic, and then are willing to follow up on it, going to the research talks isn't gonna cut it, and so that's one of the reasons why UXPA spun out of CHI, right? Was it 15 years ago, 20 years ago? UXPA spun out because the practitioners were getting frustrated. They couldn't get papers in, a bunch of things. So, but when you go to UXPA, one of the things I find is that the thing is I have this background in both research and development. So when I go to UXPA, I think, wow, people are learning stuff here, but I find it very unrigorous, and I have a lot of criticisms about, wait a minute, you're just giving this presentation, but you didn't read all this other stuff. There's just all this literature that you never read before you're giving your presentation. So, UXPA both frustrates me and encourages me in certain ways.
That division between CHI and UXPA, I think, was one of the worst development of our field over the last 2 decades.
Yeah, it would be nice if CHI could pull UXPA back in.
Totally agree.
That's what I think.
Hi, my name is Eureka, and I'm a PhD student at Northwestern University. First of all, thank you so much for bringing this topic up. And I think, like you, I'm very much a flip-flopper, even though I'm a young PhD student. I used to be a practitioner, and my background's also in cognitive psychology, and I was just never satisfied with how research is being done in industry and in practice. I have two related and possibly redundant questions. The first is, as a young researcher, do you have any advice for young researchers who want to disseminate their knowledge to the wider practice? And the second question is, I know you mentioned ways for academic researchers to disseminate their knowledge, but there seems to be a disconnect with with the ideal and what is actually possible, what can we actually do with our time as academic researchers. So do you see a possible way to overcome that challenge?
Well, I think that the fact that students come up through school and graduate school and they go into industry, that is one form of dissemination, right? Because the students are, they generally have to do research projects of some kind in order to get a master's degree or a PhD, right? So they have to read the literature, they have to write something that gets them their degree, is satisfactory to get them a degree, and then they go to work at Google or Facebook or Bank of America, and they then have this knowledge, So in other words, some students start out as researchers because they are doing a PhD or a master's degree, and they stay researchers. But most students move out of research into practice, and therefore they're disseminating knowledge, right? So that's one of the reasons why that's one of the reasons that it's a good thing to have, textbooks like Ben Schneiderman's book and Jenny Reddish's book, and those are textbooks that teach the knowledge of our field to students so that they can then go out into industry and disseminate. So you had two questions, and I think I only answered one of them.
So I mean, is there anything that we can do right now? I mean, like, I know it's great to move on to industry afterwards, but do you think there's anything that we can do right now while we're doing research?
Well, I think that people in the Chi field can, do what they can to read and to be aware of what's the knowledge of their field. So as Alan Kay was saying when he was sitting here, there are many people in this field who haven't read some of the fundamental documents of our field. Read them, and then start writing, start digesting it. Don't write necessarily journal articles, but write books like Don't Make Me Think. That book, that single book, little 100-page, 110-page book, has probably done more for web design than any other book that came out of our field. Okay?
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hello, I'm a PhD student at Georgia Tech, and like Eureka...
Georgia Tech, did
yes,
you say? Okay.
Georgia Tech. And like Eureka, I was a practitioner before returning to school to get my PhD. And one of the interesting things, and your talk was so inspiring to see this, industry, academia, research, and kind of thinking about this gap that's there. We have a lot of sessions, especially the further along we get and the closer to leaving, about which are you going to do, industry or academia? And it's like this huge just choice that's weighing on us. Like, how do you, what's your counsel for how to choose? Must we choose? And what's your advice?
How to choose? Well, obviously, I didn't really choose, right? So I sort of kept doing it all along. So I'm going to have to say I don't really have an answer for you because that's a search within kind of a question. You have to figure out what moves you, what inspires you, what makes you want to get up in the morning and go to work. I mean, if you leave your graduate program and you go to work for a company, and you have to give yourself a few months, okay? So just let things go along for a few months. But if after 6 months or a year, you find that you're continually looking at the clock and trying to figure out, how you can, get off and leave work, then you're in the wrong place, right? So, but the other side of it is that if you decide that you want to be a researcher, you might find that you're wrong, because you might find that you're not inspired to keep up with the relevant literature for your particular research field, or you may find that it's too much work to keep up with it, or you may find that as a researcher, when you go home at the end of the day, you want your weekends to yourself, you want your evenings to yourself and your family, and that doesn't happen for researchers for many times. And so you just have to pick, but that's a search within question and not a question that I can answer for you. Now, it might be that you can find yourself a mentor who can help you answer those questions.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Shujuan Chu. Just got a master's degree from Indiana University.
I'm sorry, can you speak up?
Yeah,
Louder.
my name is Shujuan Chu. Can you hear me better?
Yes, okay.
From Indiana University, Bloomington.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, thanks for sharing with us your journey, your book, Design with the Mind in Mind is one of the textbooks we use in my first year of courses, and
Okay.
really enjoyed that. I'm fascinated by this gap between research or how to bridge the gap between research and practice. And my question is, oftentimes HCI involves other disciplines. For example, if you want to design something for civic engagement, well, there's a whole body of literature in public policy, process and, about agenda setting, about the decision-making process, about community development, involving citizens. How can, well, one way to address the gap, of course, is to make the academic literature more accessible to practitioners. But another way, perhaps, is to make HCI practitioners more able to consume as consumers of academic research, especially when it involves other disciplines. So what's your take on this, especially when it comes to, for example, graduate education in HCI?
Well, thank you for your question. As I think Jonathan Lazar pointed out when he gave his talk the other day about HCI people becoming more involved in outside of our field, the difficulty there is that once you get outside of your field, the literature expands exponentially. I mean, there's this huge, so for example, Kate and I are writing this book on designing for older adults. Well, great. So it turns out that there is a big literature on that in the HCI community, but in the gerontology community, there's another literature, and there's also another literature in the neurophysiology industry, and there's, and so we could continue reading for the rest of our lives and not get through it all. And so what you have to do is sort of begin, well, first of all, you have to sort of learn how to scope it so that you don't run into this problem where you can't ever finish. The other thing is that you have to decide if you like doing that, if you like doing a lot of reading and digesting of information. And if you don't, then it's maybe not your field. Not sure I answered your question.
Well, we can discuss it later.
I'll be here afterwards. We can talk more.
Great, thank you.
Hi.
Hi, Stephanie Rosenbaum, Tech Ed. What a fantastic talk. Thank you.
Oh, sure.
It's a balancing act, and we love it.
Uh-huh.
It's a quick comment, really, and it's for the CHI folks almost more than you because of your comment about UXPA, which is I was a charter member of UXPA. The only time I didn't go to a conference was when I was in the hospital. And I still am frustrated by what I see as the lack of rigor. On the other hand, the case history STEM at this conference was placed in a tiny room which had people standing in the aisles, sitting on the floor, falling over each other on the floor. So if the comment about it would be great if CHI could draw UXPA back in is not going to happen until CHI manages even to give UX practitioners a big enough room where they can listen to the few presentations that exist on practice.
Right,
Inexcusable. I'm
right.
sorry.
But
I'm
I
sorry,
also
Kai, but it really is.
I agree with you. I also don't want to stereotype practitioners as being presenters of case studies only.
Thank you. Absolutely not. It's just the only thing we can get accepted. I've had one non-case study paper accepted at CHI since 1980-something.
Right.
And it was because it had stats in it.
Dennis.
First of all, Jeff, thank you very much for your talk and for your contributions over the years. It's really, I just want to acknowledge that. One of the barriers that I've seen in dealing often with practical problems in industry is that the people come to you who are building something and they're asking the wrong question. They're saying, should this be red or should it be blue?
Yeah,
as opposed to like the more cosmic kind of question.
Right.
I want to steal some of your expertise if I can and say, is there any way that you found to gently reshape the kinds of questions that ongoing projects come to you with and get them sort of to look more globally at what they need?
You'll get your $20 afterwards. Yeah, no, so that's basically where this book came from, Conceptual Models. So, you know, because as a consultant, basically I come in and people say, we need you to, here's a spec, we need you to design this. Actually, some of them don't even have specs. So they say, we're agile. We don't have specs. I say, okay, you're agile, so do you have, you know, weekly scrums? No, we don't do that. Do you have, you know, so they don't do anything that makes them agile, but they don't have specs. But anyway, you know, they say, okay, when can we get wireframes? And it's like, no, we're not going to get wireframes for like 6 months because we have to figure out what we're building first, right? We have to figure out what we're designing. And so we're going to do a conceptual model. Oh, how long will that take? Oh, 3 or 4 weeks, maybe a couple of months. 3 or 4 weeks, maybe a couple of months, I got these programmers in Russia who are waiting, you know, they're just sitting around. Well, okay, but actually I can get them working faster if we can develop a conceptual model, because then they can start coding and they don't have to wait for the user interface, right? So you know, so that's kind of how I do it, is that I try to convince management, by the way, not always successfully, right? But I try to convince management that we're actually going to save time and money and thrashing by thinking about what we're designing, right? The other thing that happens to me more and more often as a consultant is I go in to talk to a prospective client about a particular job, and they say, look, your rates are pretty high. We have this guy who just graduated from art school. He's really good with Photoshop, and he has piercings all over his body. Why shouldn't we hire him instead? And it's like, okay, call me when he's done. Right, because basically, you know, what I tell them is, I'm not going to give you metallic buttons. I'm going to make the number of commands or the number of operations in your application, I'm going to reduce it from 35 to 6, right? And so they, you know, sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't work. Did I answer your question? Okay, Ben.
Hi, Jeff. So I'm Ben Peterson from University of Maryland. So I'm going to close perhaps by brainstorming a little bit. You had brought up all kinds of communication challenges. So here's listening for a while, here's my thought. Our papers, our research papers, or our papers, have abstracts which are still written for other R'ers.
Okay.
One of the things we did at Maryland for many years, we have an annual HIL symposium, which is imperfect, but we try really hard to have what we call like sort of the take-home slide, because we know that we are talking mostly to practitioners, not researchers from the regional community. And it's very hard to get our mindset around there, and we're not perfect, but we've made some progress, and it's making me think, could we have, just like right now we have like the contribution statement, could we have, or I'm not even sure what the right structure is, but could we have, as part of a CHI paper, something like the single most important take-home message for a practitioner, and something like the single biggest challenge or risk or caveat, or this is what we think you should do, and this is why we are concerned. So I don't know what those are the two right things, but could we build into CHI the formal structure for how to communicate R to P, whatever.
Right, D.
And then think about how to communicate that, because that shouldn't be a section of the paper. That should be a section of CHI, these are all the things that you can apply that are reverse indexed back to the evidence to support that in the paper. Anyway, so I'll leave with that thought.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, it will apply to some papers more or less, right?
Sure.
Because I can well imagine that since at least CHI was born out of a desire for researchers to be able to communicate among themselves. And so, you know, if you know, there's this whole history of Fitts law experiments, and you do a Fitts law experiment that refines and gets rid of some confounds that were in the last 25 experiments, then that's great. But maybe practitioners aren't going to be particularly interested in it unless you've really come up with something new about how people should be using touch screens or touchpads, right? So, you know, if we did something like this, it would have to be done without putting a burden on researchers who were just trying to incrementally, you know, improve the line of research that they're on. But on the other hand, yes, it would be great if there was some. It's almost like an environmental impact statement for a paper, right? And I was like, what is the? If you were going home for Thanksgiving and you were talking to your family about what you do, what would you say about this paper? I don't know. I mean, this needs work. It's a good idea. It just needs work, and so we'd have to figure out some way. But let me make sure I understand what you're saying. It's not. You're saying it wouldn't be on each individual paper. It would be somehow a section of CHI, or?
Well, I'm thinking the paper authors would write that with their paper.
Okay.
But the way that it would be disseminated would not be by going through one paper at a time. It would be kind of collected and aggregated. So if you wanted to see what are all the things that CHI learned this year about touchscreens, you could search for the touchscreen tag and see
now
the
that's
Thanksgiving
a good idea.
Messages. That would then link back to the papers. So the papers they'd still come from the papers. They could be with the papers, but they would be pulled out and aggregated separately from the papers.
Right. Okay. Good. That's worth pursuing. I mean, because in the past, actually, CHI people, organizers, have approached me and said, "Would you like to? You know, we would like it next year's CHI or the CHI 3 years from now or whatever to have a practitioner's track. Would you like to chair it?" And I've always said, look, I'm a one-person consulting company. I don't have an administrative assistant that, you know.
No, but actually it's your big idea that made me think of this, is because I'm trying to think about ways not to have more R and more DP, but how to find the right things. And maybe there should be the push as well for the practitioners to say, this is the crucial thing I need evidence for in order to do what my intuition and experience tells me is right.
Right, and then the other side of it would be something that some of the other speakers at earlier talks have mentioned, which is, developers have problems. They have problems that they don't know how to solve, and they don't have time to solve them, or money. So researchers could actually help them with that. And so, there you go.
Okay.
Thank you.